Hello and welcome to the Focal Points with Dr. Peter McCullough and John Leake. I am John Leake, recording outside of my home studio. I'm coming at everybody from Vienna, Austria. I have on my call with me today a very special guest, a man of enormous experience and also investigative aplomb. Colonel Tom Rempfer, retired colonel in the United States Air Force, who has an amazing story to tell. As it turns out, Dr. Peter McCullough and I touch on Tom's story in our new book, Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality. Tom has also written a book about this very strange, very disturbing, and still unresolved story, even though it's been going on for 24 years now. We were just discussing before we got on the call that the public still hasn't really heard the full truth of this. So it's a gigantic story, but maybe we can tease out some of the basic outlines today. Tom, thank you so much for joining us on the Focal Points.
Thank you, John.
So let's just jump right in. Our story is anthrax, the biological agent that has long been a matter of interest for bioweapons. It has also long been an interest for vaccinating American service personnel, purportedly to protect them against bioweaponization of anthrax. Our story really kind of climaxes in 2001 with these anthrax contaminated letters, which were mailed to various persons in Congress and in the media. You were at the center of watching this as it unfolded in real time. So, could you tell our audience about yourself, your background, and how you got into this story?
Sure, John. Yeah, I appreciate the time. I appreciate the reflection. Over the years, there's been many executive branch, legislative branch, and even judicial branch entities that have acted positively on this issue. My involvement as a military officer, fighter pilot in the United States Air Force, my background was that I flew F-16s, F-117s, A-10s, finished my career flying drones. But I was a part of an official tasked by my chain of command to look into the anthrax vaccine issue, find out if there were any problems with the promulgation of the program. Worked with one of my colleagues, fellow fighter pilot, Russ Dingle. Frankly, I was kind of working for him. He was the head of our team. Again, tasked by the chain of command to bring to their attention any problems with the implementation of the anthrax vaccine program. So we took our tasking seriously, no different than flying airplanes, doing missions, making sure that we did risk assessment. And we brought to the attention of the chain of command from the very beginning that we believed the anthrax vaccine program was being implemented illegally, that the vaccine was investigational, experimental, not properly licensed, and that they needed to make sure that they gave service members their informed consent or prior consent, their option to accept or refuse what was an unapproved medical product. And so that's how it all began. Chain of command initially was receptive to our concerns, but ultimately ordered us to take the anthrax vaccine on a mandatory basis. And we refused because our obligation to our oath of office, all the military regulations is that you do not comply with patently illegal orders. And the anthrax vaccine mandate was a patently illegal order. I'll kind of walk through a timeline as we continue here. But the federal courts agreed it was illegal to mandate the anthrax vaccine. The Congress agreed in the only congressional report that it was illegal to mandate the anthrax vaccine. So That's how it all began for us. And if you want, I can start kind of walking through a instructive timeline, primarily from the years 2000 to 2001, where you had the questioning of the anthrax vaccine program by multiple entities. As I mentioned, legislative, executive, judicial. There was a great deal of oversight, checks and balances working. And that culminated in the anthrax letter attacks, which unfortunately got the anthrax vaccine program resuscitated, revived, despite the fact that it was on the verge of cancellation. So if it's okay with you, unless you have any questions, I'll walk through a little bit more of a timeline for you.
Please do. That sounds great.
Yeah, so we actually refused the vaccine in the 1998 timeframe at the very beginning. And unfortunately, they were punishing soldiers for the same thing, for refusing. They were putting people in jail. They were literally incarcerating U.S. service members and giving them bad conduct, dishonorable, other than honorable discharges, kicking them out of the military. They didn't do that with us. We believe, kind of reflecting back in retrospect, that they didn't want to highlight what we had discovered. Also that it created an incredible inequity, as far as you have, some officers that are refusing and you do nothing to them, you just ignore them. You've got enlisted men and women refusing, and you're kicking them out dishonorably and putting them in jail. So that became the premise of my fight over the last almost 3 decades, was to try to get that corrected for our troops. It was just fundamentally wrong, inequitable. And the Trump administration, in their first term, actually tried to correct the records, but were indisputably undermined by the Department of Defense in trying to get records corrected for the troops. So today, my objective is still the same thing. I use the exact same facts, the exact same government documents, the congressional findings, the court rulings to say, hey, it was illegal. You shouldn't have punished anybody. You need to correct this. And the Trump administration tried to do it. They need to follow through after being undermined in the 2018 timeframe, and they need to correct the records. It's imperative, just from the perspective of trust in our military. The good news is, with the advent of the COVID, pandemic dilemma fiasco, with COVID shots being mandated on the military in a similarly unlawful manner, they are actually moving forward in trying to correct the records for the troops with respect to those COVID punishments and discharges. It's not going perfectly, but at least they're trying, and they need to do a better job. And they also need to go back and actually fix the records for the troops that were punished over anthrax as well, just as they tried to do until undermined by the Department of Defense and other government officials. That first piece of the timeline is that congressional report, House Report 106-556. That was the only congressional report after a series of more than a dozen congressional hearings, and it found that the anthrax vaccine program was being implemented inconsistent with the law. They're soft in their language. They don't say it was illegal, but they say it was absolutely in violation, inconsistent with the law, a new law that had been passed. It was like the Department of Defense, hadn't caught up with the legislative activity, and they implemented the vaccine program as they had vaccine programs historically on a mandatory basis, even though the law specifically required that an investigational or experimental unapproved medical product could not be mandated. Unfortunately, they mandated it illegally. Fortunately, the Congress caught them with their congressional report. There were also a whole series of government accountability office reports that questioned the safety of the vaccine, the efficacy of the vaccine, even questioned the illegal, unapproved manufacturing changes that were made to the vaccine during the first Gulf War timeframe. We'd actually brought these concerns to the attention of the Congress. After testifying twice in congressional hearings, they took our concerns, put them in the congressional report, and also had the GAO investigate these unapproved manufacturing changes. And they affirmed that these were unapproved, The more strong language would be that they were illegal. They were adulterating. These unapproved manufacturing changes of fermenters, filtration processes, increasing the number of manufacturing assembly lines, all unapproved, without the proper evidence provided to the Food and Drug Administration or applications to get them approved, making them the vaccine product effectively illegal to transport in interstate commerce. Violations of current good manufacturing processes documented by the Food and Drug Administration. Food and Drug Administration had actually issued a notice of intent to revoke the manufacturer's license prior to the anthrax vaccine mandate. So here they are, they're mandating a drug product to be given to our troops. And the manufacturer is, for all practical purposes, shut down, issued a notice of intent to revoke their license. It's all unresolved at the time that they initiate the mandate. So we brought all of these things to the attention of the chain of command after we were effectively forced out of our jobs, grounded, allowed to continue to serve, but forced out of our flying jobs. These reports start coming out, validating everything that we'd been saying. We also were fortunate that our Attorney General in the state of Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal, now a United States Senator, was very responsive. His assistant attorney generals were wonderful, very responsive to our concerns. And Attorney General Blumenthal actually challenged the Secretary of Defense and the Food and Drug Administration. He said, cease and desist your illegal conduct in the 2001 timeframe. And, it's important that I also note that my colleague, Russ Dingle, who I was working with, and he was the intellectual heavyweight behind, really all of our work. He passed away in the interim. So that book that's next to me was written to kind of document our story, but his efforts, his intellectual efforts in identifying all of these fundamental reasons why the anthrax vaccine program was illegal. And ultimately, those same reasons ended applying to the COVID shot mandates as well. So my whole efforts attribute to him. The book is a tribute to him. All profits from the book end up going to his directly to his widow. And so if anybody supports the book, all proceeds go to the widow of my dear friend, the late Lieutenant Colonel Russ Dingle. But yeah,
Colonel,
anyway, go ahead, John.
yes, sir. If I could interject, straight away, as I've studied this story for our own book, and then as I've listened to you, and everything you've said has been confirmatory. The mystery that remains an outstanding intrigue is why this relentless, almost obstinate desire to get all U.S. service personnel, including a man who's flying aircraft and is obviously not going to be exposed to anthrax spores in combat. Why was the military, and it may require speculation, but why was the military so interested in getting all U.S. service personnel injected with this vaccine? It's very puzzling.
Yeah, and I don't know what the precise answer is. I think it's a confluence of factors. One is the idea that the military tends to be a captive audience. You can buy something, the government procures it, and you have somebody to take it, right? And the only way you can do that is mandating it. And so I think the captive audience explanation is one thing. There's also maybe an example to the civilian society. Our military took it; it was necessary, and therefore civilians should potentially take it as well. There were glimmers of that happening with anthrax vaccine, never really came to fruition. But with the COVID shots, absolutely, having the military take it as an example prior to the mandates or coincident with the mandates, I think was a part of the mentality. And in the military, you can tell people, hey, you got to take it, and you're expecting them to follow orders, except the military leadership and all military members know that they have a duty and an obligation to not follow illegal orders. And with anthrax and COVID, they were illegal orders. They were unlawfully implemented. And so soldiers actually had a duty to dispute it, to challenge it. And that's what soldiers did in both eras.
Well, so
Fascinating that, John, fascinating that 20 years apart, over 20 years apart, service members came to the exact same conclusion that the military was implementing orders illegally. And both programs ended up being an absolute disaster as a result of military leadership not resurveying their judgments and not listening to their troops. And I'm going to make one more point as far as kind of another echelon of why did this happen? I try to incorporate into the book some psychological factors, some psychological malfunctions that have been documented by social psychologists for years. And unfortunately, as they say, with numbing regularity, when encountering these situational ethics type scenarios, people buckle under the pressure and do the wrong thing. Both that happened with both anthrax and with COVID, and it's happened with many other similar ethical dilemmas over the years.
well, so what you said about a captive audience, that has been my intuition. It's we have this large group of men and women who have agreed to serve and have agreed to obey orders and are bound to obey orders. But what's confusing to me, and I think to probably most of the civilian audience, is I think our understanding of the military is you agree to obey the orders of your commanding officers to place yourself in harm's way to confront the enemy. But does that mean that anything that the chain of command says that you have to inject into your body, that your body, in other words, it's not just you have to face the enemy in combat and you have to not only do that, but a whole constellation of discipline you have to adhere to. But it's surprising to me that that would include, and by the way, we get to use you as a guinea pig. We get to inject in you whatever we want. I mean, how would you characterize and define the legal disposition of being a soldier required to take things, inject things into your body?
Right. And so it's a very important question and distinction. Service members, when they're implementing operational missions, our missions are, in the air, sea, and land domain and space domain in order to protect the nation, right? And so for some reason, the military got off mission when it came to these medical mandates. It's not a part of our mission. And so when you get off mission, things tend to go bad. And all our military leaders had to do was read the law. Title 10, Section 1107 of the U.S. law says soldiers cannot be mandated to take experimental products. That was with anthrax. A subset of that law was created. Title 10, Section 1107A of the United States Code said that soldiers cannot be required to take, must have the option to accept or refuse emergency use authorized products. So there were two laws that they applied respectively to both anthrax vaccine and COVID shots. And the military leadership should have realized that they were getting off course, steering off mission, and unfortunately were implementing illegal medical mandates. Unfortunately, in both cases, they failed to stay mission focused on what our real mission was, and they deviated and ended up implementing these medical mandates. That's hopefully the lesson learned long term, is that they don't get off mission in the future, because it doesn't go well when they can't even read the law. And it wasn't like these laws weren't presented to them and highlighted to them. We did it with our Tiger team in the 1998 1999 timeframe. We made the chain of command listen, and for a short period of time the chain of command listened. For a long period of time, the legislative, judicial, and executive oversight mechanisms of our government listened, and we were very successful in getting them to act. And if it's okay with you, I'll kind of, with that, I'll kind of continue with the timeline to put it all in perspective.
Well, so before we do that, just one last note on this. I mean, if you were to present this to a judge, for adjudication. I mean, you just cited the law. How did this get drawn out and court with appeals? And I mean, it seems like based on what you just told me, the law on this is clear.
Yes, it was black and white. And so that's why when Judge Emmett Sullivan of the D.C. District Court in Washington, D.C. reviewed it, it was very straightforward to him. He said basically the military knew, they've looked at all the documents. We presented to the court the documents that showed the military knew perfectly well that the vaccine program was investigational. They had submitted investigational new drug applications to try to get it properly approved. Those were all still pending. So the military knew it was illegal. They were blatantly violating the law. When the court said it, and you said it earlier, the court actually said the United States Armed Forces will not treat our soldiers as guinea pigs. When in 2003, on a preliminary injunction basis, they stopped the program. And then in 2004, they made that injunction permanent. Now, what the military then did was they coordinated with Congress and they created the emergency use authorization law under the PrEP Act. And so, even though the anthrax vaccine had been deemed an unapproved medical product, and the military and the Food and Drug Administration were ordered to get it properly licensed, which they did later on, got it properly licensed, according to the courts at least. They ended up in the interim, implementing the anthrax vaccine program on a strictly voluntary basis under the emergency use authorization law. They published in the Federal Register, and the court approved that it would be voluntary, no penalty, no loss of benefits. So the military, as of 2005, and there's all kinds of correspondence with the Department of Defense, Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, where they admitted that emergency use authorized products had to be voluntary, right? And so in offering the program after the injunction to the troops to continue the program, they affirmed that there could not be any punishments. And then, fast forward 15, almost 20 years, what does the military do with emergency use authorized EUA products with COVID shots? They mandate it, yet the documentary record, the Federal Register, the law is littered with evidence that not only did they know they could not mandate COVID shots on a mandatory basis, but it was just strictly in violation of the law. So unfortunately, they made the same mistakes, probably for those same situational ethical malfunctions, and that's how we got to the most current dilemma with COVID shots. But we're very fortunate that not only has the president said it was wrong and you need to fix it with an executive order, but also the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, has really extraordinary, unprecedented, courageous declaration that the Department of Defense's implementation of the COVID shot mandate was unlawful. So very significant, and the Department of Defense is methodically, not as quickly as I'd like, and not as quickly as the troops would like, but they are working towards record corrections, reinstatements, back pay, fixing it. That same template should be applied to the entire American population, because emergency use authorized products under Title 21, Section 360 BBB-3 actually affirms as well that citizens were required to have the option to accept or refuse those unapproved medical products as well. It just makes sense. They're experimental. No law allows citizens to be experimented upon with unapproved medical products, but that's exactly what they did, and that's why the Biden administration's mandates across the board were either declared illegal or were enjoined by the federal courts. And then the Biden administration actually had to just get all those cases dismissed so that the legal process wouldn't end up finding that those mandates were patently illegal, as they did with the large employer mandate, where the Supreme Court said, hey, this is illegal. You have to stop it.
Well, let's jump into this deeply intriguing moment in this story where we get to the spring of 2021, June of 2021, and it would seem that finally the authorities in the Department of Defense and Congress, you mentioned Blumenthal had stepped in and written some sternly worded letters. So now it's looking like this anthrax program, vaccine program for service personnel is going to be paused. My understanding was that there was a certain allowance made for certain units that were deemed to have exceptionally high risk of exposure in a combat situation. People may be working in biolabs, but for the most part, we get to June of 2021, and it looks like the anthrax vaccine program is going to be paused. Then we come to September the 11th, we have this terrorist attack, and then a week later, these letters that are contaminated with anthrax spores arrive at these different offices and media editorial offices. Can you give us a quick narrative of this story? I mean, we could talk about this, you know, for a week. It's the most intriguing story. It reads like a Tom Clancy thriller or something. But I think that the American public is still very vague about the basic narrative. So if you would tell the narrative and then tell the extraordinary upshot of all of this.
Sure. And you mentioned that, they could still give the vaccine to troops. Now, of course, the injunction happened after this time frame, after the anthrax letter attacks, after all, it was kind of the culmination of the oversight. Didn't happen for another 2 years until after the anthrax letter attacks. But I think the context that's very important is that even in 2001, because of the notice of intent to revoke the license, because of the deviations from current good manufacturing practices, the Department of Defense had run out of vaccine. The program was halted for all practical purposes. And to put it in context, some of the involvements that we had with on a state level with Attorney General Blumenthal, very encouraging, totally supportive of us, and vehemently insisting to the Department of Defense to halt the program. But also, we'd been working with veteran philanthropist H. Ross Perot, wonderful man who, really just wanted to get to the bottom of the problems with Gulf War illness. Was the Gulf War illness related to anthrax vaccine? It sure seems so. It was the largest exposure. Department of Defense has done everything they can to not study it. So he was trying to get to the bottom of that. And he reached out to myself and Lieutenant Colonel Dingle, and he worked with us for several years, sent us to meetings all around Washington, D.C. And one day he got Karl Rove to call me up, and Karl Rove, White House advisor to President George Bush, called me up, wanted me to feel confident that he was asking for the program to be reviewed by the Department of Defense. And this set a bunch of activity in motion. He specifically tasked, and these letters are in the appendix of the book. It's all documented. Not only the letter from Ross Perot to Karl Rove and the White House to ask for the review, but then the Rove letter to Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz in the Pentagon, telling them, ordering them to review it because it was a political problem for the administration. They wanted it reviewed. And so the good news was they tasked undersecretaries in the Department of Defense, Dr. David Chu and Pete Aldridge, to review it. And then ultimately, I got a copy, it's in the book, of their recommendations to Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld to effectively halt the program, minimize use of the vaccine that didn't exist anyway because they'd run out of it, minimize the use of the vaccine, develop a new vaccine, something that they had been trying to do since 1985. So literally almost 20 years prior, they had recognized, published in the Federal Register, and submitted a request for proposal in order to get a new vaccine because they knew the current vaccine was not properly efficacious or safe. And so the Department of Defense undersecretaries to Rumsfeld are telling them to do exactly what's been asked to be done since 1985, develop a new vaccine. And unfortunately, what happens is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Hugh Shelton, and General Abizaid end up objecting. They say that the anthrax vaccine is the centerpiece for biological defense. Now, this is just laughable if you've actually been tracking what's going on. The plant is shut down. the vaccine is experimental. Everybody's acknowledging that they shouldn't be using it. The Congress has put out a report that you shouldn't be mandating it. The GAO has put out multiple reports to say it's not effectively, safe or efficacious. And so it's a total disaster. But they warn Rumsfeld not to cancel it because it is the centerpiece for biological defense. And this is happening at the very end of August of 2001. Well, what happens approximately a week and a half later is 9/11, and the entire nation is off balance. The entire nation is scared, and so those communications that I'm having with the White House with Karl Rove, primarily through his secretary, other than the communications where he reached out to us to give us the confidence that they're doing the right thing. Well, as of September 17th of 2001, they totally cut off communications. They send me an email that says, effectively, a copy of it's in the book. Carl says that the Department of Defense is going to handle this from here. I'm fine with that. Just do the right thing. Cancel the program as you had already recommended that the program be canceled. But instead, what happens is 1 day later, anthrax letters go in the mail on September 18th. The first wave of anthrax letters go in the mail. And so the entire nation is not only off balance because of 9/11, but now there's anthrax letters. And the indication from the letter is, Allah is great. The implication is that it's some kind of a international terrorist type action. But they actually say in the letters, take penicillin now, which is fascinating because it was really only Department of Defense scientists that knew that simple antibiotics were fully effective in saving people's life. So embedded in within that letter, what foreign terrorist is going to tell you to take penicillin, something that's actually going to save your life from these anthrax letters? But ultimately, somebody inserts that into the letter, tells everybody to take penicillin. Had they promptly taken penicillin, there would have been zero fatalities. Unfortunately, there were 5 fatalities as a result of the anthrax letter attacks. And it wasn't just that first wave of attacks. There was another wave of attacks that occurred in the middle of October. So we had been continually working despite 9/11, despite our disappointment that after the anthrax letter attack first wave, it appeared they were trying to resuscitate the anthrax vaccine program. Despite all of this good scrutiny that was going on and recommendations to stop it, these anthrax letters basically were successful in the Department of Defense completely reversing course and trying to turn the anthrax vaccine once again into a centerpiece of biological defense, even though the plant was shut down for quality control deviations. So,
So in
go
other
ahead.
words, a purported act of terrorism
Right.
does work.
Yeah, and so unfortunately, people took the bait. The government took the bait. Everybody is reacting to it. And at the time, we weren't taking the bait. We were actually warning people. I was warning the Federal Bureau of Investigation that the only people that stand to gain from these anthrax letter attacks are people within the Department of Defense or biodefense enterprise that didn't want this program to be canceled.
So
And
let's
so
let's Colonel,
we
if we could focus on that. I have a background in writing true crime books, and uh, when I read the outlines of this story, I couldn't help but quickly smelling a rat on this. I mean, it seems to me that the FBI was rather slow, rather tardy to recognize that this whole purported attack, the references to Allah, these kinds of clumsy dramatization to make it look like it's an attack from abroad, tied in with September the 11th. I mean, I think any seasoned law enforcement investigator would recognize that there are strong elements of staging in this. So I would like to kind of drill down on that. I mean, you recognize, well, cui bono in this. Well, it's the guys that are interested in maintaining, the program. I mean, do you believe that the FBI was so naive that they didn't recognize the signs that this was staged?
No,
Or
I think they absolutely did. I was working with one FBI agent who's actually a personal friend of mine, worked with him in the Air Force. He was a reservist, and he agreed with us. The New York office was serious about looking into this. Initially, was tasked with the investigation. Only after being tasked with the investigation for the anthrax letter attacks and taking it seriously and wanting to go after a domestic source was suspiciously the investigation taken away from the New York office and transferred to the Baltimore office. But let me give you a little bit more background for context, because in addition to working with Rove, Mr. Perot, Blumenthal, representatives in Congress, included Representative Gephardt and Senator Daschle. They'd actually written a letter for us just a couple months earlier to Secretary Rumsfeld, questioning the punishments, questioning the vaccine, questioning the mandate. Senator Daschle was the highest level official in Congress questioning the anthrax vaccine mandate directly in written correspondence after we briefed his staffers in Washington, D.C., on the behest of H. Ross Perot, and he coordinated the meeting. And so he's questioning the anthrax vaccine directly to the Department of Defense and the Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. Guess who was attacked in the second wave of anthrax letters? Senator Daschle's office. And the only reason I had personal knowledge of this real time was on that very day that they opened the anthrax letter. I was in Washington, D.C. I was submitting a citizen petition to the Food and Drug Administration, filing it at FDA headquarters in Rockville, Maryland. And on my way out of town, I called my staffer contacts in Senator Daschle's office, who'd been wonderful. They'd been keeping us informed the entire way of trying to work with the Department of Defense to modify, stop the mandatory program, get them to resurvey their judgments. And so I'm talking with them on the phone. I'm waiting for my staffer to come on the phone. The secretary comes back and tells me, Major Rempfer, I was a major at the time, we've just opened an anthrax package and we need to evacuate the office. And they hung up on me. And I'm at the airport reporting into their office what my latest progress is. And the anthrax letter is literally been opened on Capitol Hill in the Hart Building. And so I fly home. I immediately contact the FBI. I want them to understand, hey, I was in Washington, D.C. I was on the phone with them when they opened the letter. Senator Daschle was questioning the anthrax vaccine program, and now he's been attacked with anthrax. That is really suspicious. My FBI contacts agreed it was very suspicious. Ultimately, the FBI does everything they can to avoid running down that line of reasoning. And over the next 10 years, they actually try to accuse, as a person of interest, somebody who is a non-government scientist. But fortunately, 10 years later, the evidence is overwhelming that the attack came from within. It came from Fort Detrick. It came from an insider. It effectively was a false flag attack, a fear bomb, in order to get the anthrax vaccine program resuscitated. And that is the premise of the FBI report that comes out by 2009 in a preliminary form, 2010 in its final form, the Amerithrax report. Word search motive. The motive was to save the failing anthrax vaccine program. You would have thought that the FBI would have actually talked about the congressional pressure on the anthrax vaccine, the White House inquiry of the anthrax vaccine, the recommendations within the Department of Defense to cancel the anthrax vaccine, and Senator Daschle's pivotal, absolutely relevant inquiry to the Department of Defense. And then he is literally the highest official that is attacked with anthrax, but the FBI omits any connection with Daschle being attacked to motive. And a matter of fact, they go in the other direction and they imply that nobody has any inkling as to why Senator Daschle was attacked. It's blatantly a disingenuous lie to the American people.
well, so
And
so so let's linger on that if we may.
sure.
So my first question is, um, how let's just make the assumption, because I think it's a very plausible assumption. Somehow the perpetrator at Fort Detrick was aware of these senators who received, to whom he mailed the letters, he was aware of their involvement in their activities and shutting or apparently shutting down the program, or at least creating a high probability of the program getting shut down. Do we have any idea, and it may require speculation, how did the perpetrator know about these proceedings? Do we know?
Yeah, I mean, the letter to Rumsfeld was signaled, publicized. I was provided a copy of the letter by a Washington Post reporter
Okay.
in September of 2001. So prior to his second round of attacks, he was aware
Got it.
publicly that Senator Daschle was questioning the anthrax vaccine, and then he was attacked with anthrax. And Ari Fleischer and others are publicly saying we believe it's a domestic source. They basically analyzed the spores and realized they came from our own stockpiles.
Okay.
It
Okay.
took years for them to actually pinpoint the actual test tube that it came from, which led back to this one particular scientist. And that's why they named him as ultimately they believed he was the perpetrator, and they were about to indict him before he actually committed suicide in the summer of 2009. And so they were never actually to follow through with prosecution of that individual. But I believe they got the motive right. I'm agnostic as to whether or not he was the perpetrator or the lone perpetrator, but I believe they got the motive right. They were trying to save the anthrax vaccine program. And I think it was intellectually incumbent upon the FBI to explain to the American people that GAO, Congress, Karl Rove, the Bush administration, the Pentagon were all questioning the anthrax vaccine program, and that was directly linked to motive to save the anthrax vaccine program. But it's all not resident in the FBI report, which is to me fascinating and intellectually corrupt.
Well, so to me, and just to reiterate, I mean, coming from a true crime background, I mean, to use blunt language, I mean, I call BS on the FBI. There's just no way they're acting in good faith in this. But who is calling the tune that the FBI is dancing to in this? Do we have any idea whose interests are they representing? I mean, obviously, it's not truth, justice, in the American way. The FBI is in the service of some interest group. What is it? Did we ever, can you speculate about that?
Yeah, I'll speculate, and I'll give you a couple examples. So in the 2000 timeframe, we had filed a False Claims Act suit against the manufacturer for providing a product that was not compliant with current good manufacturing practices, and indeed had actually been adulterated according to the strict definitions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And the Department of Justice appeared to be very interested for an entire year in pursuing that prosecution of the manufacturer. But once they looked into it, they realized that the Department of Defense was intimately involved in all of these illegal manufacturing changes that altered the purity, stability, potency, and sterility of the product, again, in violation of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so what happened after the anthrax letter attacks, I think it just goes to basic human nature. People were scared. And so everybody's telling them, we have to have anthrax vaccine because the threat is real. I mean, literally for the preceding few years, they'd been going into congressional testimony saying the threat is real, the threat is real. Suddenly the threat was materialized. It wasn't a real threat. It was a threat that could be countered with antibiotics. Department of Defense knew that. The vaccine wasn't even necessary. The billions and billions wasted were completely ridiculous. But also the threat being real was something that it's very hard for people to respond to that, to fight back against that when you have generals with 4 stars on their shoulders telling you we have to have this anthrax vaccine. So the Department of Justice calls us up and tries to convince us that, hey, we're not going to intervene in the case, and we're not going to charge the manufacturer. And their reason was the Department of Defense has had intimate involvement in all of these illegalities. And so even if we were to fine the manufacturer under the False Claims Act, it would become a circular exercise with the Department of the Treasury that would actually be paying the penalty. So they decided to not intervene. And their main reason was they did not want to deny the Department of Defense their access to anthrax vaccine as they were trying to get the manufacturer reopened. So, 20 years later, it just seems absolutely ridiculous. They should have gone after the manufacturer, even if the Department of Defense was intimately involved. And another coincident activity that we were involved with was filing that citizen petition. The citizen petition I filed on 15 October 2001, the day of the second anthrax letter attack on Senator Daschle. A year later, they came out with a letter to us that said, you're absolutely right. The vaccine has not been properly licensed, and we need to address that. We need to go ahead and get the vaccine properly licensed. We need to finalize that anthrax vaccine license that has remained in limbo since 1985 when they posted a proposed rule but never finalized it in the Federal Register. It was an unlicensed medical product by the Food and Drug Administration, totally contrary to Department of Defense rhetoric about it being a safe, effective, and FDA-approved product. It was not, and that ended up becoming the foundational basis of the DC District Court federal court case and injunction, where they shut the program down. They cited our citizen petition, and they said, hey, it's not even licensed. You got to license it. It's illegal the way you're implementing it, and we're shutting it down. So a little
Well,
bit more background.
so to go back to the FBI, which is, and it seems to me, just disingenuous at best, in this. I mean, is it safe to say is a kind of as a generalization that the Department of Justice takes its march orders from the Department of Defense? Is the Department of Defense who's really in charge of this country? I mean, you go back to the Romans, and ultimately, it was the guys who held military power who ran the show. Is it still the case in the United States?
No, I give that an absolute thumbs down, John. The Department of Defense is in charge of nothing but the mission. And the problem is when mission creep ends up being in conflict with the Constitution and the laws of this country. Department of Defense is subordinate to the civilian authority, the executive branch directly. So the Department of Justice may have been taking inputs, may have been scared by the Department of Defense, but ultimately, unfortunately, the White House office did an about face, and rather than continuing dialogue with us, and rather than continuing to provide oversight and call this for what it is, and go after the domestic terrorist right off the bat when they knew perfectly well it was a domestic source, and that all fingers pointed back to Fort Detrick that wanted the program resuscitated. We had also filed Department of Defense Inspector General reports. Those Department of Defense Inspector General reports were actually referred to the FBI Public Corruption Squad. Those reports were never acted on, and it was all the same basic concerns. Good manufacturing process deviations, improperly licensed vaccine, never finalized license, illegal mandatory use for investigational purposes, all ultimately validated by federal courts, GAO, and the Food and Drug Administration itself. But the Department of Defense referred that over to the FBI, and the FBI could have run with it. So somebody else in the Department of Justice or in the executive branch that effectively runs the Department of Justice and the FBI, somebody else was calling the shots and telling them, let's not go there. We're dealing with too much. And unfortunately, they didn't seek at the time the ground truth. Ultimately, the ground truth did come out because the FBI does admit 10 years later that the anthrax letter attacks were perpetuated by an insider and the motive was to save the failing anthrax vaccine program. The problem is everybody went underground. Blumenthal, Daschle, Gephardt, Bush, Rove, the Department of Defense, nobody decided to say, oh gosh, we were actually investigating this, recommending it be stopped. Now it appears that the anthrax letters were the only thing that got it started. Nobody went back to investigate the ground truth. Nobody went back to fix the punishments that Senator Daschle had been questioning that were quote unquote meted out. Nobody went back and did the right thing. And part of this, and this goes to context to motive, is that during those intervening years, massive amounts of money were allocated to the biodefense enterprise. The PrEP Act, the 2005 Emergency Use Authorization Law, the Patriot Act. This threat, okay, even though it was specious and came from the inside, was so powerful and so successful in getting massive amounts of money allocated to this industry, this cottage industry, that nobody went back and questioned it. Nobody went back and did the right thing that they were already trying to do. Nobody went back and resurveyed their judgments. Nobody went back and corrected the records for our troops, except for President Trump, who attempted to do so because, once again, his administration was listening. White House officials were contacting me. They were reading my thesis from the Naval Postgraduate School, and they put a directive out to the Department of Defense to correct records in 2018, but they were totally undermined by military and government officials, and the military only corrected 2 records at that time out of thousands and thousands of people that were punished.
Well, we've have observed a pattern since, and I'm speaking of Dr. McCullough and I, since 2020, where you'll have somebody like what's now Senator Richard Blumenthal, who seems to be on our fighting side. And then there seems to be, just looking at the timeline, a moment where something changed his point of view about the matter. And it's very, very intriguing. I won't speculate on on what exactly changed his point of view, but now he's on the fighting side of vaccines without qualification, without critical evaluation, or are great, and anybody like Dr. Peter McCullough who's questioning them is a charlatan and a fool. We just had a Senate hearing.
I watched it.
Yeah. So, well, I feel like we could just have multiple conversations about this. Why don't we have a part two? But before we go to part two, let's end this on a cliffhanger. I would like to just ask you, and insofar as you're comfortable giving me your perception or your opinion about it, what do you make of Bruce? Is it Ivans or Ivans? What is the proper pronunciation of the man's name?
Ivans.
Ivans. What do you think of the purported case that he was the perpetrator?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I'm agnostic to who the actual perpetrator was, or whether or not he acted alone. Um, uh, Bruce Ivans, based on the FBI documentary evidence, was a troubled man. And so I'm, mental illness, mental wellness issues are near and dear to my heart for citizens that suffer from them. Somebody in the Department of Defense probably should have identified them and done something about them long prior to that event. Now, unfortunately, instead, what they were doing was they were giving him awards. They literally awarded him the highest civilian awards as a civilian military government appointed scientist. They gave him the highest awards for getting the anthrax vaccine program restarted as a result of his murderous anthrax letter attacks. And so that is the correct pronunciation of the name. I'm not 100% sure whether he's the guy that did it. The FBI seems to be, based on the preponderance of the evidence, sure that he's the guy that did it. I think that it's highly problematic, and I think that the Department of Defense biological, defensive, or what could be perceived as offensive capabilities are given a tail to tooth review. It does seem like under RFK Jr. and President Trump, that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to go after dangerous research. Clearly, the Wuhan lab leak was an example of that, which to some extent there was shared responsibility between the United States and the Chinese. All the reports, the COVID origin reports, all of the major government entities have all agreed, literally at this point, that it was most likely a lab leak, not a natural occurrence. And so I think that is a great step off point for a potential part two, where we discuss my naval postgraduate school thesis, where I tried to warn them about all this. The president put out a 2018 National Biodefense Strategy, which basically mirrored the conclusions and recommendations of that naval postgraduate school thesis. But unfortunately, the Biden administration did not implement that strategy. That strategy called for all the stakeholders to be at the table. But instead, what the Biden administration did was they operated in an extremely siloed and stovepipe White House response to the COVID pandemic. They didn't bring all the stakeholders together. And the reason they didn't was they never acknowledged that it was a bioincident. So therefore, the triggering event for the National Biodefense Strategy to be activated never was activated because they misled the American people that it was a natural occurrence. So I think that would be a great follow-up discussion for us to have.
Well, let's do it. Two more questions, and then we'll wrap for today. Do you know when Ivans was first identified as just a person of interest? Um, the documentation I've seen, it was pretty early. It was, hey, what about this guy? But then there was no real action taken against him. Do you know when he was first identified as a person of interest?
Yeah, it was late in the investigation. I would say that it was probably literally not until late 2008, 2009 when they did the genetic testing of the test tube and when they decided to settle with the gentleman that they had wrongfully accused, Dr. Stephen Hatfill, who was not a government insider, right? So the whole, Patsy MO was alive and well. Let's accuse somebody that was outside of the government or the military. Now, Dr. Stephen Hatfill courageously defended himself. And to this day, he's actually been appointed by the Trump administration to be a part of the Department of Health and Human Services. So I think that's great. But I think it was also great that the Department of Justice actually settled with him. They paid him $5.8 million for wrongfully accusing him and naming him as a person of interest. And so that was all in the literally late spring, early summer of 2009, just prior to the preliminary Amerithrax report.
Well, and do we know what was their stated grounds for targeting Stephen Hatfill? What did they have some kind of, I don't know, purported grounds for suspecting him? I'm not suggesting that they were legitimate grounds, but what did they claim to be their reason for suspecting Hatfill?
Yeah, I think it was based on the most specious of grounds, tips, and they honed on him as a convenient patsy outside of the military and government industrial complex.
That was my precise perception, and I have to say, to me, the shifting of the focus to Hatfill, I suspect that somebody must have identified Bruce Ivans is at least a person of interest. It seems to me the totality of circumstances suggest he might have been a person of interest a hell of a lot earlier than is stated in the official documentation of the case.
Yeah,
Uh,
the FBI was derelict in their duty. It was a total cover up. I mean, the going after Hatfill was an attempted cover up and distraction. I was providing tips since I was on the phone with Dashiell's office when they opened the anthrax letter, what they termed as an anthrax package. I was providing them tips immediately saying you need to be looking at Fort Detrick. They have a tendency, an MO for exposing people to dangerous biological substance. They have the motive to get this program, specifically the anthrax vaccine program, resuscitated. Ultimately, that becomes the stated motive by the Department of Justice. And they have the expertise for handling weaponized and producing weaponized anthrax spores. Nobody else does. They know how to do it. And so the FBI should have, from day one, been pursuing this. But what they did was they put a former military man, Mueller, in charge of the FBI just prior to the anthrax letter attacks. And he, just like the White House stovepiped the COVID response, he stovepiped and siloed the Amerithrax investigation to make sure that these alternative theories that ended up being true were not pursued. And so, to some extent, I think Comey was involved in that as well. And so, Mueller, who came in 2 weeks prior to the anthrax letter attacks, retired right after the Amerithrax report admitted, not him personally admitting that they were totally off track and totally misdirected this investigation for almost 10 years. Nobody was able to learn the lessons from it because they didn't put the lessons learned in the Amerithrax report. They specifically omitted evidence that was relevant to the investigation and should have been curious to the American people.
Well, let's end on that rather discouraging but deeply intriguing note. Our taxpayer dollars at work in Washington, but it's a deeply intriguing story. As I think Lord Byron famously said, truth is stranger than fiction. To me, this story beats all of the sort of thriller novels about the daring do of the CIA or the military or whatever. I mean, this is just beats them all. So let's follow up with a second conversation about how this is a precedent of what we then saw with the biodefense industry, the PrEP Act leading up to 2019, 2020. So let's do that. And in the interim, I thank you for all of your hard work and effort and courage in pursuing this matter. I know you've had to encounter a fair amount of people who would discourage you from doing this. So we thank you for your service, and let's talk again soon, Colonel. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, John. I'm encouraged the Trump administration is trying to do the right thing. They need to make sure they put in the guardrails to make sure they're not undermined this time around like they were before.
Well, we'll hope for the best with President Trump's administration. Thank you so much.
Thanks, John. Take care.